Aegon III Targaryen died in the 26th year of his reign in the year 157 AC at the young age of 37. While the king was still a young man when he died, he looked much older than his 37 years. Given his troubled life and the stresses he endured during and after the Dance of the Dragons, his sickly look and early death surprised very few at court. In truth, the king died inside the day he witnessed his mother, Queen Rhaenyra, killed by his uncle, King Aegon II, in the last days of the Dance of the Dragons. The trauma of that event never left him and haunted him till the end of his days. While King Aegon III only lived 37 years, mentally he had been through much more than most men his elder, and all of it took its toll. Opinion on Aegon, by the lords and small folk, seems very neutral, with very few actively disliking him or taking issue with his rule. But at the same time, he was hardly anyone's favourite king. While his reign was filled with some turbulence, mostly during the Regency period, King Aegon III did bring the stability the Seven Kingdoms needed in the wake of the Dance of the Dragons, while the wounds left by the war began to heal. He had also brought stability to House Targaryen by providing a clear and secure line of succession that would hopefully mean an event such as the Dance of the Dragons could never tear House Targaryen or the wider kingdom apart again. It was hoped at the time that this would be the last civil war among the members of the royal family. In truth, that hope would simply be a dream, and few could predict the events that would transpire over the next few decades. Aegon left behind 2 sons, Daeron and Baelor, and 3 daughters, Daena, Rhaena, and Alyna, as well as his queen, Daena Velaryon, and his younger brother, Prince Viserys, who had been serving his brother faithfully as Hand of the King for many years prior to his death. The eldest of King Aegon's sons, Daeron, was only a boy of 14 when he assumed the throne. While he was older than his father when he came to power, Daeron was still not yet a man and had not come of age. Perhaps because of Daeron's notable charm or genius, or perhaps because of the memory of what transpired during the bloody regency period of Daeron's father, Prince Viserys wisely chose not to insist upon a regency period while the young king was in his minority. Instead, Viserys chose to serve as Hand, while King Daeron ruled ably and capably, but at the same time being willing to learn about the pitfalls of governance from his uncle. It was hoped that the team of Daeron and Viserys would bring a new age of prosperity to the realm. While there was some pushback at the idea of no regency, many who raised objections tended to be men hoping for a position on the proposed Regency Council. In the end, any who dissented loudly enough to become a problem were reminded that the legendary King Jaehaerys hardly had a regency period when he was in his minority, and even during that brief time, the king was a power in his own right, thanks to Jaehaerys' willfulness and determination to be listened to, and is remembered as perhaps the best king Westeros ever saw. At the time of his coronation, few in the realm foresaw that Daeron, the first of his name, would cover himself in glory on the scale not seen since the days of Aegon the Conqueror himself, whose ruby crown he wore. The choice of using the Conqueror's crown was deliberate. His father, King Aegon III, had preferred a simple circle to match his modest dress. The choice of the Conqueror's ornate ruby crown was meant to send a message to the realm that Daeron was not his father. In fact, he was different in many ways, but at heart he would make a strong king. Yet all the glory Daeron would achieve during his short reign turned to ashes almost as swiftly. He was said by those who knew him that he was a youth of rare brilliance and forcefulness, that there was a true fire within him, driving him onwards, that in many ways he was a dragon made flesh. King Daeron at first met resistance from his uncle and Hand Prince Viserys and his councillors and many great lords up and down Westeros, with the exception of the Marcher Lords, when he first proposed to complete the conquest, something that had eluded every Targaryen king before him, something that even Aegon the Conqueror could not achieve, an idea so challenging that most kings never even considered it in the first place. But not so with this ambitious young king. It was Daeron's aim to bring the southernmost kingdom of Westeros, Dorne, into the realm at last, and under the control of House Targaryen, completing Aegon's dream of a united Westeros, 7 kingdoms under one king. This would not be an easy task. There had been several small wars with Dorne in the years since the conquest, but not on the scale that Daeron was proposing. His small council did their best to make the case for peace, and his lords reminded them that unlike the Conqueror and his sisters, he had no more dragons fit for war, and slim to no chance of hatching the remaining eggs on Dragonstone. To this, Daeron famously responded, "You have a dragon, he stands before you." King Daeron I Targaryen's proposal to complete the conquest and capture of Dorne in the name of House Targaryen took all by surprise, from his hand Prince Viserys to the lords up and down Westeros. It is said his small council and his hand spent meeting after meeting, spanning several hours each time, trying to talk the king down from his drastic idea. While the Seven Kingdoms were at peace with Dorne, despite countless petty conflicts over the centuries, it was still a peace, with the shadow left by the Dance of the Dragons casting a looming shadow over the idea of breaking it unprovoked by House Martell was not an appealing prospect. There was also those who wondered if the Seven Kingdoms was ready for another war, and how many men would answer the call, while the events of the dance were still in living memory. But for the small council, the biggest single concern was how House Targaryen would fare at warfare without the aid of their now dead dragons. If Dorne could not be held with the dragons, how would they be able to hold them without them? But in the end, despite the countless warnings and fears of his hand, small council and lords, the young dragon, King Daeron, could not be gainsaid, and it is said that when he talked of Dorne, it lit a fire inside him, and that perhaps he truly was a dragon made flesh. If this invasion was going to be successful, they would need a plan, and a good plan at that. By the year 157 AC, there had been several attempts to conquer Dorne, and countless petty conflicts with them. Even at the peak of Targaryen power in Westeros, and with the use of their dragons, they were unable to capture and hold Dorne, with the Dornish becoming a thorn in the side of many king. If Daeron's dream was to come to fruition, he would need to draw from the experience and knowledge of all his loyal and trusted lords. Plan, the king did, and he did so with the help and advice of Alyn Velaryon, with the unquestioning support of the legendary Oakenfist, who had spent significant time in Dorne and at the court of House Martell. Some began to think it could indeed be done. It would be a bloody and hard-fought conflict, but perhaps this time the victory that had eluded House Targaryen would come. There are some at the Citadel who argue that in some ways Daeron's plan for the proposed campaign improved upon that of Aegon the Conqueror's own, despite the loss of the Targaryen dragons in the dance. In some ways, the lack of dragons made this first generation of post-dance Targaryens an unknown quantity. When Daeron's invasion did finally begin, after countless time planning, he amply proved his prowess on the fields of Dorne, which for hundreds of years had defied the Reach, the Stormlands, and even the dragons of House Targaryen. King Daeron divided his host into three separate forces. One was led by Lord Tyrell of Highgarden, who moved his host down the Prince's Pass at the western end of the Red Mountains of Dorne. The second one was led by Lord Alyn Velaryon, the Oakenfist, who was of course travelling by sea, passing through the stepstones and into the waters of the coast of the Arm of Dorne. The third and final host was led by King Daeron, the young dragon himself. The king marched down the treacherous pass known as the Boneway, where he made use of goat tracks and hidden passes that many, even among the Dornish, considered too dangerous. This bold and unpredictable move by Daeron allowed him to go around the Dornish watchtowers and traps that had been set there for centuries. The very same watchtowers and traps that had once caught out Orys Baratheon, the hand of the king and half-brother to Aegon the Conqueror, during the First Dornish War in the years directly after the conquest. Orys' capture in the Boneway resulted in the loss of his sword hand. The young dragon, once successfully through the Boneway, then swept away every force that sought to stop him, taking many of his foes by surprise. The Prince's Pass was won with a similar ease by Lord Tyrell, and most importantly, to the success of the invasion effort, the royal fleet broke the Planky Town and was then able to drive themselves up the Greenblood River into the heart of Dorne itself. Again, another unprecedented and unforeseeable act in the eyes of many of the Dornish. After this first initial push into the Red Sands of Dorne, Dorne itself had effectively been divided in half by Lord Alyn's control of the Greenblood River and the waters around the now ruins of Planky Town. This means that the Dornish forces in the east and west could not aid one another directly, but it also cut off vital supply lines across the country, with House Martell unable to provide much needed supplies, food, and fresh drinking water to their forces in the west. From this stemmed a series of bold and bloody battles that would take countless volumes of books in the libraries of the Citadel to recite in full. There are even several smaller skirmishes whose details have not been recorded at all due to the sheer scale of Daeron's invasion. Out of all the accounts of the war that can be found, the best of them is the Conquest of Dorne, which is supposedly King Daeron's own account of his campaign, which is rightly considered a marvel of its elegance and simplicity in both its prose and in its strategies. While Daeron had successfully managed to capture most of Dorne, one huge task still remained to him, one that would not be so easy, and one which held the key to successfully holding Dorne: the capture of Sunspear and subjugation of House Martell. King Daeron I Targaryen's initial invasion of Dorne surprised all with its speed and the scale of his success. Even his most loyal supporters could not have foreseen how sound and unquestioned the success of this initial invasion was. The plan devised by King Daeron and Alyn Velaryon, the Oakenfist, to attack from 3 different directions with the aim of dividing Dorne in half, thus blocking supply lines and any hope of reinforcement, was a stroke of genius. Especially the bold move of sending the royal fleet up the Greenblood River, which proved to have a huge impact on the success of the invasion. Even without dragons, the main power behind House Targaryen since Aegon the Conqueror took Westeros 158 years before, King Daeron's invasion was perhaps the most effective and efficient, with some making the argument that the fact he did it all without dragons meant Daeron's invasion outclassed the first invasion of Aegon the Conqueror and any that followed him. As word of the success of Daeron's invasion spread from the sands of Dorne to the Wall in the far north, the mood of the lords and small folk alike turned from pessimism and doubt to begrudging support, with some formerly doubtful lords sending additional men to aid in Daeron's efforts. Every time House Targaryen had attempted to invade Dorne, it was always pushed back or undone very quickly, so much so that many in both Dorne and the rest of Westeros vowed an invasion may not physically be possible, owing to the harsh terrain and tactics used by the Dornish themselves, who used Dorne's harsh landscape to their advantage. The invasion even took House Martell by surprise, who had assumed that without dragons, House Targaryen would stand little or no chance in the sands of Dorne, let alone achieve the success they did in such a short amount of time. No one predicted or foresaw an attack, let alone at the scale and speed of King Daeron's. In many ways, the Dornish had no time to react or coordinate a proper counter-offensive. Within a year of the start of the conquest, the invaders were at the gates of Sunspear, the gleaming capital of Dorne. Before Daeron could capture Sunspear itself, he needed to battle his way through the so-called Shadow City. While the odds were very much in Daeron's favour at this point, sieges often give the defender an advantage when it comes to physical combat. It would be a hard-fought, bloody process, playing into the strengths of the Dornish hit-and-run guerrilla tactics that were the bane of many invader. The Dornish knew their city well, and knew how best to defend it, but inevitably, the Shadow City was taken, followed quickly by the fall of Sunspear itself, in a similar hard-fought process. By the year 158 AC, the Prince of Dorne himself, and 200 of the most powerful Dornish lords bent their knee to King Daeron at the submission of Sunspear. The young dragon had accomplished what Aegon the Conqueror never had, and no king since could achieve. The mass bending of the knee would leave a bitter taste in the mouth of many of the Dornish lords. As is the way with the Dornish, despite the submission of House Martell and the great lords, there were smaller factions that refused to surrender and would fight on regardless of the odds of success, to the bitter and bloody end. They would never surrender, no matter how good the terms presented by Daeron were, or how hopeless their situation looked. Most of these rebels remained away from the larger towns and settlements, and hid themselves in the desert, high in the almost impregnable mountain passes. Tactics that had famously worked during Aegon the Conqueror's first invasion of Dorne, and had allowed for the Dornish to defend their land ever since, were put into practice. These men were swiftly branded as outlaws by King Daeron, and they were not taken as a serious threat to the king's plans for Dorne. Ultimately, however, these outlawed men were small in number and very fragmented across the entirety of Dorne. Another pressing issue King Daeron faced, and one there was no quick fix for, was the discontent among the Dornish smallfolk at the prospect of their new Targaryen overlords. The invasion had been bloody, with many smallfolk left bereft and fearing for what their lives would look like under House Targaryen. Many saw the Targaryens as the old enemy, not just in the 158 years since Aegon the Conqueror, but much further back, to the days of old Valyria at its height of power and the destruction of the Rhoynar, whom many of the Dornish descended from, via Princess Nymeria and her 10,000 ships, who fled the dragon flame of the Dragon Lords, whom reduced the cities that trailed up and down the Rhoyne River to nothing but ash. There were some who feared the same fate would have awaited the Dornish, if not for the death of the last dragon. But regardless, King Daeron had captured Dorne in spectacular style. Now for many came the hard part, and the part that was the undoing of many Targaryen kings before him, keeping it. In the year 158 AC, King Daeron I Targaryen had invaded and captured Dorne in quick and decisive fashion, to the surprise of all. But looking back through the last 150 years of Targaryen history, it shows us capturing Dorne is one matter, controlling it was another altogether. The people of Dorne were tough and strong-willed, and would not idly sit back and allow themselves to be subjugated by a foreign invader without a long and bloody hard-fought fight. Almost as soon as Sunspear was taken, bands of rebels and outlaws popped up all across Dorne, while for now, nothing more than a nuisance for Daeron, but an issue that would need to be dealt with before it grew into a bigger, more dangerous problem. However, King Daeron did quickly consolidate his control of Dorne, dealing with these small bands of rebels when he found them, be it in the desert or in the high passes of the Red Mountains. The king knew if he was to keep his new conquest, no mercy could be shown to the outlaws. But ridding himself of these rebels was not without difficulty. In fact, it could be argued that putting down each and every band of outlaws took longer and was more troublesome than the actual invasion. In one infamous episode, a poisoned arrow meant for the king was instead taken by his cousin, Prince Aemon, the younger son of Prince Viserys. The young prince, who was 22 years of age, was sent home by ship from Sunspear to recover. While Aemon did survive the incident, there were some who feared for the prince's life when he boarded the ship back to King's Landing. Even so, by the year 159 AC, the hinterlands were pacified, the rebels under control, and the young dragon, King Daeron, was now free to return in triumph to King's Landing, with Dorne firmly under the control of House Targaryen. The king did not trust any of the Dornish lords to keep his peace in his new kingdom, so Lord Tyrell and a contingent of the royal army and fleet stayed in Dorne to keep the peace. There were some fears that the removal of so much of the Targaryen force from Dorne would spark new uprisings, but Daeron had an answer for that he hoped would prevent this. As assurance for Dorne's future loyalty to the Iron Throne and good behaviour, 14 highborn hostages of the greatest houses of Dorne were carried back with King Daeron to King's Landing to act as hostages, and with the hopes that these hostages in the capital could build bridges between the Dornish houses and the rest of the Seven Kingdoms. The sons and daughters, almost all the great houses of Dorne were selected. All had to send a hostage. All willingly did. This tactic proved less effective than Daeron might have hoped. Whilst the hostages helped ensure the continued loyalty of their own blood, the king had not anticipated the tendencies of Dorne's small folk on such a massive scale. The issue was the king had no hold on them, or way of keeping them in line, such as the great houses. 10,000 men, it is said, died in the battle for Dorne. 40,000 more died over the course of the following 3 years, as common Dornishmen fought on stubbornly against the king's men. Lord Tyrell, whom Daeron had left in charge of Dorne, valiantly attempted to quell the fires of rebellion, travelling from castle to castle with each turn of the moon, punishing any supporters of the rebels with the noose, burning down the villages that harboured the outlaws, and so on. But the small folk struck back, and each new day they found their supplies stolen or destroyed, camps burned, horses killed, and slowly the count of the dead soldiers and men-at-arms rose, killed in the alleyways of the Shadow City, ambushed amidst the dunes, murdered in their camps. But the true rebellion began when Lord Tyrell and his train travelled to Sandstone, where his lordship was murdered in a bed of scorpions. As word spread of his demise, open rebellion swept Dorne from one end to the other. Dornish letters recorded in Maester Garth's Red Sands suggest that Lord Corgyle Lord of Sandstone himself, arranged for Lord Tyrell's murder. However, his motives were subject of speculation in later years. Some say he grew angry that his early show of loyalty by putting an end to the rabble-rousing of one of the more notorious rebel lords was given such little consideration by Lord Tyrell, while others claimed that his initial aid was all part of a treacherous plan he made with his Castellan to lull the king and Lord Tyrell into trusting him. In 160 AC, the young dragon himself was forced to return to Dorne to put down the rebels. He won several small victories as he fought through the Boneway, while Lord Alyn Oakenfist descended once again upon the Planky Town and the Greenblood. Apparently broken and defeated in 161 AC, the Dornishmen agreed to meet to renew their fealty and discuss terms of surrender, but it was treachery and murder they plotted, not peace. In a bloody betrayal, the Dornish attacked the young dragon and his retinue beneath a banner of peace. 3 knights of the Kingsguard were slain attempting to protect the king, with a 4th, to his eternal shame, who threw down his sword and yielded. Prince Aemon, the Dragon Knight, the younger son of Prince Viserys, was once again wounded, and this time captured, but not before cutting down 2 of the betrayers. The young dragon, King Daeron himself, died with the Sword of Kings Blackfire in his hand, surrounded by a dozen enemies, cutting down several before being overwhelmed and cut down himself. King Daeron I's reign was thus only 4 short years in length. He died at the age of only 18. While he did achieve great feats during his short reign as king, his ambition had proved too great, and he paid the price. Glory may be everlasting, yet it is fleeting, as well soon forgotten in the aftermath of even the most famous victories, if they lead to great disaster.